It's interesting to me because this is obviously told in a one-shot scenario. It's shot and edited to look like one shot. You could run the risk of becoming a gimmick, but you don't. And I'm curious for you as a filmmaker, where is that balance in the sense of as you look at the scope of your film, as you're sitting there and editing, is part of you going, I don't want to go too much there that might cue the audience into thinking it's a quote-unquote gimmick, but I want to tell the story, the more human story. How do you balance that?
It's a daily dialogue with yourself. I mean, it's a very good question. You know, you're trying never to sacrifice the intimate to the epic, but you also never want to sacrifice the epic to the intimate. You want a balanced, constant, and that is your daily dialogue. You want those shots that are memorable. You want those shots that, when you sit down with your friends, say, what's your favourite Roger Deakins shot? You can debate it, but you also don't want to be so self-advertising as for it to become just about the visual style. So the debate with this movie was, well, how do we do it in a way that doesn't seem gimmicky? And indeed, the movie, during the course of the movie, the camera doesn't go through a keyhole or follow the course of a moving bullet or go through glass or anything like that. So it observes some gravity and some physics. But at the same time, it never gets stuck behind the central gravity. It never repeats itself, I don't think. And we had not many rules because the camera is constantly vacillating between the subjective and the objective gaze, intimate and then epic. But one of them was, panning back and forth between two characters. That's not one shot for me. That's just a badly edited scene. How do we construct the scenes so that they naturally fall in front of this snaking camera? And at times, the characters by the landscape are pulled away, and other times they're sort of drawn back together again. I want the audience to feel like they're being pulled through the movie, on a kind of gravitational pull, rather than being presented with images, and that, what you describe is instinct. That's what you do as a director. You try to find a balance between, an emotional piece of storytelling and also telling us other things, geography, the amount of distance still to go, the time ticking down, the different conditions, atmospheres, shapes, sounds. You're constructing an experience for an audience. People say to me, what message do you want an audience to take away? And I said, I don't think of it in terms of messages.
It's a human story.
Yeah, also, it's a number of things. You want people shifting their relationship with characters throughout. You want people to take away images, unconscious things, not always conscious things. Film works more like a dream at times. If I knew if I put it into words, I'd just write an essay about it. But for whatever reason, it was a story I wanted to tell in pictures as much as in words. In many cases, in this movie, more than in words. And so that trying to develop that visual style is everything.
One of my favorite moments ever as a film fan was watching Hitchcock's Rope for the first time and reading stories about how he would try to find these film mags that were 10 minutes long, and he had to make these cuts even though he wanted continuous shots, and he would go behind Jimmy Stewart's jacket and he would cut in the black of the jacket and then come out. How did you decide where the stitches would take place? In the sense
we did a couple of those. We did a couple of
Were those influenced by Rope a little bit, or
no? I think that listen, Hitchcock had a much more difficult job because admittedly, he wasn't travelling the distances we travelled, but he didn't have visual effects, and I think that's a huge thing here. How did we decide? Sometimes it was that we were shifting locations, sometimes we were shifting the camera rig, sometimes it was an emotional choice to do with the actor just couldn't keep going on that level. I had to give him a break, so that it was always. And sometimes it was about landscape. Sometimes they're buried at moments that you absolutely are not looking, moments of high drama, high emotion. Sometimes it's just a good old-fashioned, foreground wipe, as we call it, a man walking from left to right in the foreground, and it just operates as a split screen, and all you have to do is match the A and the B side. So, there are some pretty rudimentary ones, and there's some incredibly sophisticated ones. And it just depended on where we were in the scene, and an instinct again.
Deakins is an amazing cinematographer, and you think about the flare sequence. I mean, I'm just blown away by the lighting in this movie. Obviously, the natural lighting, the way you use clouds and sun. He is a filmmaker who has been very heavily advocating digital filmmaking recently. He shot Skyfall digitally, this Skyfall, or Sicario digitally as well. For you as a director, you worked on film for a long time. Obviously, American Beauty was shot 35, and Jarhead, I believe, was shot 35 as well. What are your thoughts on digital? And like with someone like a Deakins who comes from such a great background of film, he can achieve that look of film using digital in a way that only he can, I feel like.
Yeah.
Do you feel like we've gotten to a point where digital can look like film? And what do you think about someone like Roger Deakins switching from digital or film to digital, and can it look like film?
It looks more and more like film. We couldn't have shot this movie on film because of the size of the cameras. So that was a simple, practical thing as well. They're developing so fast. It's going to be impossible soon to justify shooting on film, but not yet. And I am a big believer in choice. In a movie like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, for example, which is a kind of paean, a sort of nostalgic poem to a lost age. It feels absolutely right, and the only way you could tell it is on film. The softness of it, the feeling of romance in a way about it. So it depends. I mean, I shot Spectre on film and Skyfall on digital, and I love having the choice. So that's what I would think is the best version. Is that audiences and filmmakers should be able to choose from both.
And last thing, Thomas Newman's score is brilliant.
Yeah.
It's a leading character in this film. Can you talk about how you direct Thomas Newman as a composer? Because scores are leading characters just as much as your characters are that are on screen.
Yeah.
Can you talk about your process of directing a composer in order to weave in and out with the themes of what your characters are going through, and just that idea of process of score? It's just fascinating.
Yeah, it's one of the most interesting relationships. It was a really tricky movie to score because it's a very present tense film. And the moment you take one step too far in either direction, you kind of commenting on it or you're distancing us from it. And so it needed to stick to the characters, moment to moment. But then at a certain point, it goes into night, and then it becomes a much more expressionistic, a much more full-bodied, expressive score. And it was knowing when to go big, and it's not always in the obvious moments. That was the trickiest thing. But Tom is, we've been through all sorts of different genres and styles together. He scored the Bond movies with me, which he'd never done before. And I think that process also made us more confident with the bigger strokes, the bigger, more ambitious side of the movie. But the other thing, of course, and this is crucial, is that normally you govern rhythm and pace in the edit, but we didn't have the ability to edit here. So sometimes pace, rhythm, momentum comes from music. And one of the key ways to sustain tension in the movie, because we sustain it almost to breaking point at times, is musical. So he was, even more than usual, it was a crucial, integral part of the movie.
I know this story comes from a lot of stories you had heard throughout your life from your grandfather, and my grandfather fought in World War II, so I remember having great discussions with him showing me things he had from the war. Do you have a very specific story and memory of sitting down and hearing one particular story from him, or an artifact that he maybe had or gave you, not maybe specifically designed around this story, but something you remember sitting down with him and talking about?
I have specific images of my grandfather and that time in my life. I mean, I remember him washing his hands incessantly in his sink in his bedroom, and we used to laugh at him. And I said to my dad, why does he do that? And he said it's because he could never get clean. He remembers the mud of the trenches. He could never get his hands clean. And that really struck me. And so we used to pester him to tell us the stories, but he never told the stories to his own children, so my dad never heard them. It was only when he was in his 70s and his grandchildren were all around him. And by this time, he'd retired to the West Indies. He was born and brought up in the West Indies, in Trinidad. He would sit on the porch, and you could hear the sea in the distance. And, have a couple of rums, and he would start telling us the stories. Wow. And one particular image he told, and that was, I remember many images, but one particular wouldn't let me go, which was he told a story about carrying a message across no man's land, in dusk, actually, in the mist. And that image of that little figure in that vast wilderness, that really stayed with me. And when I sat down to write, I found that was the story I wanted to try and explore. And that became two entirely different characters, two entirely different people, and an entirely different set of circumstances. But the spirit of his stories, which were all about luck and coincidence and chance, and none about conventional bravery or heroism, that was what I hope is in the movie. So yeah, it was pivotal.
I know this might be a tough thing to pick, but you have two characters in this film. If you were to look at each of them, and which one would you find your grandfather in the most? And I don't mean that in a sense of like one played better than the other, but is there one that you look at the screen and go, that's him?
To be honest with you, no. But if you're asking which one is the most similar, Blake is the most similar because he's the one who's this natural storyteller, and he's the one who's the talkative one. Schofield is very English. My grandfather was not that kind of reserved, quiet, internal figure. He was very expressive, and he was small and deaf, and so he talked very loudly, and he was extremely amusing and charismatic. So yeah, but I once we went into character, I didn't really think about my grandfather. I thought I needed to construct a kind of odd couple of people who wouldn't necessarily be friends in life. You know, the image I gave the boys was Schofield. If you were in the pub, Schofield would be sitting by the fire on his own with a book and his dog by his feet, and Blake would be onto his fourth pint, standing at the bar with 5 of his mates telling dirty stories. And that those are the two people. They would never normally mix in real life, but in a war situation, often those social structures are stripped away, and you make unusual friendships. And some people find that in the sporting arena. They play amateur sport and they meet people that they wouldn't normally meet in their own life. That's the case for me, and it's something I thought about a lot when I was writing it. So that was the kind of relationship I wanted to construct, and that was completely original.
Well, first of all, congratulations to both of you. I know Sam's talked a lot about talking to his grandfather, basing the story kind of around ideas that his grandfather told him about when he was younger. I was curious for you, growing up for me, my grandfather was in World War II, so I listened to a lot of stories he told me. He gave me a lot of cool things from the war and things he had at the house. What was your experience growing up? What war stories were you ever told from family members? And do you remember specific instances of sitting down with family members and talking about certain war stories? Obviously, it wouldn't be World War I, but what do you remember growing up about that?
Did you have any?
Oh, no, actually, the only reference to the First World War is on my dad's side. My dad's Australian, and his granddad had only just moved across from Ireland when he was a teenager, when he then fought with the Australian forces and then made it back to Australia. So that's the only connection I have, but I never met him. I only found that out recently.
Wow, and did you have any family members who ever talked about that, or?
Yeah, I had my granddad. He used to tell me stories about his brothers who fought in the Second World War, and I think one of them as well in the First World War. But I remember one in the Second World War where in London there was a burning house, and his brother ran in to save someone, and he was staying in there too long to look to see who was in there, and came down and yeah. But I can't really remember, to be honest. But there was a few good stories. He still talks about it all the time.
Wow, that's amazing. About that running shot. And I'm sorry if you've already answered this, but I'm very curious about the people who run into you during that shot. Were those planned at all? Were any of them like scheduled to hit you at a certain point? And
It's like a 317.
Yeah, but when you actually do take the hit, was there a part of you that thought maybe the cut was messed up and you just kept going? Like, can you talk about those moments where you get hit in those moments?
Yeah, without sort of giving away too much because of where it falls in the story, but those were just collisions that we didn't plan for. But I think the main message was, or sort of the stay on message was, just keep going until they call cut. And at that point, we knew the character so well, and there's a sort of beautiful purity to what my character has to do in that moment that I just kind of just kept going, really.
Now, in the beginning, you two are walking through the trenches, and those are some of the most incredible shots I've ever seen from even Roger Deakins, just in general, just the walking with you guys, or rushing through the trenches to get your orders and then go back. Can you talk about shooting those scenes in those specific 8.5-minute shots or takes where the camera is following you? How do you not look at the camera by mistake? How do you not look at someone else? I know you're acting, but do you have to make a point not to make sure you look down at that lens?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you just sort of, you sort of unconsciously obviously know it's there. The whole thing with this film is that it was like a choreographed dance between the cameras and the actors. But I think just in them 6 months, we sort of, the rehearsal period, we knew where the camera was going to be. But I don't know. It's just like on a normal film, you know not to look down the camera.
These are long shots.
Yeah,
really long.
And you're just fully immersed in the story you're trying to tell for these 8, 9, 10-minute takes. That you forget you really are making a film, and you just ignore everything else, don't you?
Yeah, and it's sort of it's a mixture of completely ignoring it, but then also we were so used to having the team around us because we've been rehearsing together for months beforehand, kind of working out those shots and those sequences. It's kind of an inside-outside thing on the scene where you're mainly inside the scene and inside the moment, but then you know, but then when there's someone in front of you, you can't, you can't completely sort of forget about it in certain instances. But and the joy of working in a way that we have done with this is that you learn to work with them in that moment, and that they're not just observing. Like, it's not always that they're just observing you doing your thing and being your character. That you kind of work with them, as Dean put it. It's kind of like a dance.
Now, I absolutely loved you on Game of Thrones. I thought you were brilliant on that show. I wanted to ask you this since I saw the show and I never got a chance to interview you until now. When you go out the window, what was that scene like to shoot as an actor? And do you remember what it was like to fall? Like, what did you fall onto? I'm just curious from a filmmaking standpoint how that scene was done.
Yeah, it was quite weird because we did like I think it was like 2 or 3 different camera angles on that bit. So I didn't know, what one they was going to go with. Like, we filmed one from the front, one from the side, one from the back. And at that time, I was just gutted. They were killing me off. I was just like, I wish I could just come back and do one more season because I was enjoying it so much.
Can you say something? Like, can you go, guys, come on, don't write me off? Like, do you go there to them?
I mean, it was the best route to take the story, and I know that. My character only had a little bit of, it wouldn't have been right if he stayed on. The story would have died a little bit. But yeah, it was amazing. I mean, it was a real window, and I'm not sure how tall it was, but the time I was standing on the ledge, it was pretty high up, and they had cardboard boxes stacked up and a blue crash mat on top of that, and I had to fall and then keep my face, pointing in a neutral position, but last minute, like, turn my head so I don't smack my nose. But there was a few times where it was like a little bit delayed, and I'd be like nearly breaking my nose.
Well, it's an amazing shot, and now we have a movie where you're a Lannister and a Stark are playing brothers.
Yes, Richard Madden,
which is amazing to think about. One thing about this movie that I find so fascinating is the human story aspect of it, and the beauty of what Sam Mendes does is you have a one-shot idea. You don't want to make that a gimmick. You want the story to be a very important part of it, which is what he does. As actors, though, when you read the script, did you know where the stitches were going to be? Did you know, like, obviously you rehearsed, you know when you're doing them, but did you know when you were reading them where the stitch was going to be, or is that something you do on the day?
No. It was, we never knew when we were, it's not specified in the script, but we worked out, because we choreographed the whole thing, essentially, in the rehearsal process, which was 6 months. We'd come to learn where the kind of hidden stitches would be then.